The First Night. The Story of the Merchant and the Demon. It is said, O wise and happy king, that once there was a prosperous merchant who had abundant wealth and investments and commitments in every country. He had many women and children and kept many servants and slaves. One day, having resolved to visit another country, he took provisions, filling his saddlebag with loaves of bread and with dates, mounted his horse, and set out on his journey. For many days and nights he journeyed under God's care until he reached his destination. When he finished his business, he turned back to his home and family. He journeyed for 3 days, and on the 4th day, chancing to come to an orchard, went in to avoid the heat and shade himself from the sun of the open country. He came to a spring under a walnut tree, and, tying his horse, sat by the spring, pulled out from the saddlebag some loaves of bread and a handful of dates, and began to eat, throwing the date bits right and left until he had had enough. Then he got up, performed his ablutions, and performed his prayers. But hardly had he finished when he saw an old demon, with sword in hand, standing with his feet on the ground and his head in the clouds. The demon approached until he stood before him and screamed, saying, "Get up, so that I may kill you with the sword, just as you have killed my son." When the merchant saw and heard the demon, he was terrified and awe-stricken. He asked, "Master, for what crime do you wish to kill me?" The demon replied, "I wish to kill you because you have killed my son." The merchant asked, "Who has killed your son?" The demon replied, "You have killed my son." The merchant said, "By God, I did not kill your son." "When and how could that have been?" The demon said, "Didn't you sit down, take out some dates from your saddlebag and eat, throwing the bits right and left?" The merchant replied, "Yes, I did." The demon said, "You killed my son, for as you were throwing the stones right and left, my son happened to be walking by and was struck and killed by one of them, and I must now kill you." The merchant said, "Oh my lord, please don't kill me." The demon replied, "I must kill you, as you killed him, blood for blood." The merchant said, "To God we belong, and to God we return. There is no power or strength, save in God the Almighty, the Magnificent. If I killed him, I did it by mistake. Please forgive me." The demon replied, "By God, I must kill you, as you killed my son." Then he seized him, and, throwing him to the ground, raised the sword to strike him. The merchant began to weep, and mourn his family and his wife and children. Again the demon raised his sword to strike, but the merchant cried until he was drenched with tears, saying, "There is no power or strength save in God the Almighty, the Magnificent." Then he began to recite the following verses. Life has 2 days, one peace, one weariness, and has 2 sides, worry and happiness. Ask him who taunts us with adversity. Does fate save those worthy of note or press? Don't you see that the blowing, raging storms only the tallest of the trees beset? And of earth's many green and barren lots, only the ones with fruits and stones are hid. And of the countless stars in heaven's vault, none is eclipsed except the moon and sun. You thought well of the days when they were good, oblivious to the ills destined for one. You were deluded by the peaceful nights, yet in the peace or night does sorrow stun. When the merchant finished and stopped weeping, the demon said, "By God, I must kill you, as you killed my son, even if you weep blood." The merchant asked, "Must you?" The demon replied, "I must," and raised his sword to strike. But morning overtook Shahrazad, and she lapsed into silence, leaving King Shahryar burning with curiosity to hear the rest of the story. Then Dinarzad said to her sister Shahrazad, "What a strange and lovely story." Shahrazad replied, "What is this compared with what I have to tell you tomorrow night, if the king spares me and lets me live? It will be even better and more entertaining." The king thought to himself, "I will spare her until I hear the rest of her story. Then I will have her put to death the next day." When morning broke, the day dawned and the sun rose. The king left to attend to the affairs of the kingdom, and the vizier, Shahrazad's father, was amazed and delighted. King Shahryar governed all day, and returned home at night to his quarters, and got into bed with Shahrazad. Then Dinarzad said to her sister, "Shahrazad, please sister, if you are not sleepy, Tell us one of your lovely little tales to while away the night. The king added, let it be the conclusion of the story of the demon and the merchant, for I would like to hear it. Shahrazad replied, with the greatest pleasure, dear happy king. The second night. It is related, O wise and happy king, that when the demon raised his sword, the merchant asked the demon again, must you kill me? And the demon replied, yes. Then the merchant said, please, give me time to say goodbye to my family and my wife and children. Divide my property among them and appoint guardians. Then I shall come back so that you may kill me. The demon replied, I am afraid that if I release you and grant you time, you will go and do what you wish, but will not come back. The merchant said, I swear to keep my pledge to come back, as the God of heaven and earth is my witness. The demon asked, how much time do you need? The merchant replied, 1 year, so that I may see enough of my children, bid my wife goodbye, discharge my obligations to people, and come back on New Year's Day. The demon asked, do you swear to God that if I let you go, you will come back on New Year's Day? The merchant replies, yes, I swear to God. After the merchant swore, the demon released him, and he mounted his horse sadly and went on his way. He journeyed until he reached his home and came to his wife and children. When he saw them, he wept bitterly. And when his family saw his sorrow and grief, they began to reproach him for his behavior, and his wife said, husband, what is the matter with you? Why do you mourn when we are happy celebrating your return? He replied, why not mourn when I have only 1 year to live? Then he told her of his encounter with the demon and informed her that he had sworn to return on New Year's Day, so that the demon might kill him. When they heard what he said, everyone began to cry. His wife struck her face in lamentation and cut her hair. His daughters wailed, and his little children cried. It was a day of mourning, as all the children gathered around their father to weep and exchange goodbyes. The next day he wrote his will, dividing his property, discharged his obligations to people, left bequests and gifts, distributed alms, and engaged reciters to read portions of the Quran in his house. Then he summoned legal witnesses, and in their presence freed his slaves and slave girls, divided among his elder children their shares of the property, appointed guardians for his little ones, and gave his wife her share, according to her marriage contract. He spent the rest of the time with his family, and when the year came to an end, save for the time needed for the journey, he performed his ablutions, performed his prayers, and, carrying his burial shroud, began to bid his family goodbye. His sons hung around his neck, his daughters wept, and his wife wailed. Their mourning scared him, and he began to weep as he embraced and kissed his children goodbye. He said to them, children, this is God's will and decree, for man was created to die. Then he turned away, and, mounting his horse, journeyed day and night until he reached the orchard on New Year's Day. He sat at the place where he had eaten the dates, waiting for the demon with a heavy heart and tearful eyes. As he waited, an old man leading a deer on a leash approached and greeted him, and he returned the greeting. The old man inquired, friend, why do you sit here in this place of demons and devils? For in this haunted orchard none come to good. The merchant replied by telling him what had happened to him and the demon, from beginning to end. The old man was amazed at the merchant's fidelity and said, yours is a magnificent pledge, adding, by God, I shall not leave until I see what will happen to you with the demon. Then he sat down beside him and chatted with him as they talked. But morning overtook Shahrazad, and she lapsed into silence. As the day dawned and it was light, her sister Dinazad said, what a strange and wonderful story. Shahrazad replied, tomorrow night I shall tell something even stranger and more wonderful than this. The third night. When it was night and Shahrazad was in bed with the king, Dinazad said to her sister, Shahrazad, please, if you are not sleepy, tell us one of your lovely little tales, to while away the night. The king added, let it be the conclusion of the merchant's story. Shahrazad replied, as you wish. I heard, O happy king, that as the merchant and the man with the deer sat talking, another old man approached, with 2 black hounds, and when he reached them, he greeted them, and they returned his greeting. Then he asked them about themselves, and the man with the deer told him the story of the merchant and the demon, how the merchant had sworn to return on New Year's Day, and how the demon was waiting to kill him. He added that when he himself heard the story, he swore never to leave until he saw what would happen between the merchant and the demon. When the man with the 2 dogs heard the story, he was amazed, and he too swore never to leave them until he saw what would happen between them. Then he questioned the merchant, and the merchant repeated to him what had happened to him with the demon. While they were engaged in conversation, a 3rd old man approached, and greeted them, and they returned his greeting. He asked, "Why do I see the 2 of you sitting here, with this merchant between you, looking abject, sad, and dejected?" They told him the merchant's story, and explained that they were sitting and waiting to see what would happen to him with the demon. When he heard the story, he sat down with them, saying, "By God, I too, like you, will not leave until I see what happens to this man with the demon." As they sat, conversing with one another, they suddenly saw the dust rising from the open country, and when it cleared, they saw the demon approaching, with a drawn steel sword in his hand. He stood before them without greeting them, yanked the merchant with his left hand, and, holding him fast before him, said, "Get ready to die!" The merchant and the 3 old men began to weep and wail. But dawn broke, and morning overtook Shahrazad, and she lapsed into silence. Then Dinarzad said, "Sister, what a lovely story." Shahrazad replied, "What is this compared with what I shall tell you tomorrow night? It will be even better, it will be even more wonderful, delightful, entertaining, and delectable, if the king spares me and lets me live." The king was all curiosity to hear the rest of the story, and said to himself, "By God, I will not have her put to death until I hear the rest of the story, and find out what happened to the merchant with the demon. Then I will have her put to death the next morning, as I did with the others." Then he went out to attend to the affairs of his kingdom, and when he saw Shahrazad's father, he treated him kindly, and showed him favors, and the vizier was amazed. When night came, the king went home, and when he was in bed with Shahrazad, Dinarzad said, "Sister, if you are not sleepy, tell us one of your lovely little tales to while away the night." Shahrazad replied, "With the greatest pleasure." The 4th night. It is related, O happy king, that the 1st old man with the deer approached the demon, and, kissing his hand and feet, said, "Fiend and king of the demon kings, if I tell you what happened to me and that deer, and you find it strange and amazing, indeed stranger and more amazing than what happened to you and the merchant, will you grant me a 3rd of your claim on him for his crime and guilt?" The demon replied, "I will." The old man said, "Demon, this deer is my cousin, my flesh and blood. I married her when I was very young, and she a girl of 12 who reached womanhood only afterward. For 30 years we lived together, but I was not blessed with children, for she bore neither boy nor girl. Yet I continued to be kind to her, to care for her, and to treat her generously. Then I took a mistress, and she bore me a son, who grew up to look like a slice of the moon. Meanwhile my wife grew jealous of my mistress and my son. One day, when he was 10, I had to go on a journey. I entrusted my wife, this one here, with my mistress and son, bade her take good care of them, and was gone for a whole year. In my absence, my wife, this cousin of mine, learned soothsaying and magic, and cast a spell on my son, and turned him into a young bull. Then she summoned my shepherd, gave my son to him, and said, "Tend this bull with the rest of the cattle." The shepherd took him, and tended him for a while. Then she cast a spell on the mother, turning her into a cow, and gave her also to the shepherd. When I came back, after all this was done, and inquired about my mistress and my son, she answered, "Your mistress died, and your son ran away 2 months ago, and I have no news from him ever since." When I heard her, I grieved for my mistress, and with an anguished heart I mourned for my son, for nearly a year. When the great feast of the immolation drew near, I summoned the shepherd, and ordered him to bring me a fat cow for the sacrifice. The cow he brought me was in reality my enchanted mistress. When I found her, and pressed against her to cut her throat, she wept and cried, as if saying, my son, and her tears coursed down her cheeks. Astonished and seized with pity, I turned away and asked the shepherd to bring me a different cow. But my wife shouted, "Go on, butcher her, for he has none better or fatter. Let us enjoy her meat at feast time." I approached the cow to cut her throat, and again she cried, as if saying, "My son! My son!" Then I turned away from her, and said to the shepherd, "Butcher her for me." The shepherd butchered her, and when he skinned her, he found neither meat nor fat, but only skin and bone. I regretted having her butchered, and said to the shepherd, "Take her all for yourself, or give her as alms to whomever you wish, and find me a fat young bull from among the flock." The shepherd took her away and disappeared, and I never knew what he did with her. Then he brought me my son, my heartblood, in the guise of a fat young bull. When my son saw me, he shook his head loose from the rope, ran towards me, and, throwing himself at my feet, kept rubbing his head against me. I was astonished and touched with sympathy, pity and mercy, for the blood hearkened to the blood and the divine bond, and my heart throbbed within me when I saw the tears coursing over the cheeks of my son the young bull, as he dug the earth with his hoofs. I turned away and said to the shepherd, "Let him go with the rest of the flock, and be kind to him, for I have decided to spare him. Bring me another one instead of him." My wife, this very dear, shouted, "You shall sacrifice none but this bull." I got angry and replied, "I listened to you, and butchered the cow uselessly. I will not listen to you and kill this bull, for I have decided to spare him." But she pressed me, saying, "You must butcher this bull," and I bound him and took the knife. The dawn broke, and morning overtook Shahrazad, and she lapsed into silence, leaving the king all curiosity for the rest of the story. Then her sister Dinarzad said, "What an entertaining story." Shahrazad replied, "Tomorrow night I shall tell you something even stranger, more wonderful, and more entertaining, if the king spares me and lets me live." The fifth night. The following night Dinarzad said to her sister Shahrazad, "Please, sister, if you are not sleepy, tell us one of your little tales." Shahrazad replied, "With the greatest pleasure. I hear, dear king, that the old man with the deer said to the demon and to his companions, 'I took the knife, and as I turned to slaughter my son, he wept, bellowed, rolled at my feet, and motioned toward me with his tongue. I suspected something, began to waver with trepidation and pity, and finally released him, saying to my wife, I have decided to spare him, and I commit him to your care. Then I tried to appease and please my wife, this very deer, by slaughtering another bull, promising her to slaughter this one next season. We slept that night, and when God's dawn broke, the shepherd came to me without letting my wife know, and said, "Give me credit for bringing you good news." I replied, "Tell me, and the credit is yours." He said, "Master, I have a daughter who is fond of soothsaying and magic, and who is adept at the art of oaths and spells. Yesterday I took home with me the bull who had spared to let him graze with the cattle, and when my daughter saw him, she laughed and cried at the same time. When I asked her why she laughed and cried, she answered that she laughed because the bull was in reality the son of her master, the cattle owner, put under a spell by his stepmother, and that she cried because his father had slaughtered the son's mother. I could hardly wait till daybreak to bring you the good news about your son." Demon. When I heard that, I uttered a cry and fainted, and when I came to myself, I accompanied the shepherd to his home, went to my son and threw myself at him, kissing him and crying. He turned his head towards me, his tears coursing over his cheeks, and dangled his tongue as if to say, "Look at my plight." Then I turned to the shepherd's daughter and asked, "Can you release him from the spell? If you do, I will give you all my cattle and all my possessions." She smiled and replied, "Master, I have no desire for wealth, cattle, or possessions. I will deliver him, but on 2 conditions. First, that you let me marry him. Second, that you let me cast a spell on her who had cast a spell on him, in order to control her and guard against her evil power." I replied, "Do whatever you wish and more. My possessions are for you and my son. As for my wife, who has done this to my son and made me slaughter his mother, her life is forfeit to you." She said, "No, but I will let her taste what she has inflicted on others." Then the shepherd's daughter filled a bowl with water, uttered an incantation and an oath, and said to my son, "Bull, if you have been created in this image by the all-conquering, almighty Lord, stay as you are. But if you have been treacherously put under a spell, change back to your human form, by the will of God, creator of the wide world." Then she sprinkled him with water, and he shook himself and changed from a bull back to a human form. As I rushed to him, I fainted, and when I came to myself, he told me that my wife, this very deer, had done to him, and to his mother. I said to him, Son, God has sent us someone who will pay her back for what you and your mother and I have suffered at her hands. Then, O demon, I gave my son in marriage to the shepherd's daughter, who turned my wife into this very deer, saying to me this is a pretty form, for she will be with us day and night, and it is better to turn her into a pretty deer than to suffer her sinister looks. Thus she stayed with us, while the days and nights followed one another, and the months and years went by. Then one day the shepherd's daughters died, and my son went to the country of this very man with whom you have had your encounter. Some time later I took my wife, this very deer, with me, set out to find out what had happened to my son, and sent to stop here. This is my story, my strange and amazing story. The demon assented, saying, I grant you 1/3 of this man's life. Then, O King Shahryar, the second old man with the 2 black dogs approached the demon, and said, I too shall tell you what happened to me, and to these 2 dogs, and if I tell it to you, and you find it stranger and more amazing than this man's story, will you grant me 1/3 of this man's life? The demon replied, I will. Then the old man began to tell his story, saying, The dawn broke, and morning overtook Shahrazad, and she lapsed into silence. Then Dinarza said, This is an amazing story, and Shahrazad replied, What is this, compared with what I have to tell you tomorrow night, if the king spares me and lets me live? The king said to himself, By God, I will not have her put to death until I find out what happened to the man with the 2 black dogs. Then I will have her put to death, God the Almighty willing.